Welcome everybody. About 5 minutes ago, it looked like our conversation about climate reporting was going to be really dry and boring and just like 7 of us in the room, but it turns out it's really popular, which doesn't surprise most of us who've been doing this for a while at all, I think. So welcome. We're going to have a chat about how this gets technical when you're an investor. This morning, Catherine said on the innovation panel that we have hope levels rising after the conversation we had last night, which I think is good because the brief for this was to make climate reporting and analysis, in fact, feel tractable, which wasn't quite as bad as have a light-hearted conversation about where we've gone wrong on climate change. But it was a sort of similar type of challenge. And so someone actually said to me last night that they'd been at an event where everyone had been talking about ESG more generally a couple of weeks ago, and someone was up on the stage and they were giving everyone a hard time, as many of you will have heard, the hard time that you get when you sort of say, this is all really, really difficult, diversity is really tough, you know, best man for the job, and also can I have a whine about climate change, which is often the conversation that we have when we get into these rooms. And some young person stood up, as was related to me, and said, actually, could we make this about solutions and not about what's hard for you? So hopefully we're going to go in that direction today. But we'll probably go for what's hard for you to start off with a bit, because of course that's relevant. And luckily I've got some of the best in the business with me here to help discuss the topic. So we've got Steve Bullock, who is the head of research at Trucost. I've got Bruno, who is, and Bruno, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, sorry.
I noticed you avoided doing that.
It's got a lot of vowels, for those of you who've read it.
In Belgium, we would say Royce, but everybody gets it wrong, even in Belgium, so you can call me, if you can say Rolls-Royce.
Royce. Bruno Royce, who is the London head for Carbon Delta, and then Rick Walters, who is the head of infrastructure for GRES. 3 organisations that have got quite a history in this space, providing analytical solutions, data, basically helping people solve this question of how do I think about climate risk in my portfolio and then report on it. So that's very promising. So we're going, as far as the agenda goes, we're going to do a sort of what's hard for me, a little bit, and then what's being done and what solutions are out there, order-wise. But what I'm first going to do is just get each of my panellists to give a little introduction to what they've been doing and the approaches they've been taking. Then we'll jump into some Q&A from me. And audience, please feel free, because as these things always do, we'll get to 5 minutes before the end and then I'll go, oh gosh, the audience should ask some questions. Chuck your hand up as we go through if you have a question, if you've got something you really want to prosecute, particularly the front row, because that's the front row tax. So I'm going to hand it over.
Sure, thanks. Is that working?
Yes.
Yeah, great, excellent. So yeah, just to begin with, I guess, at Trucost, we're working with corporates and investors in the area of reporting, and therefore we sort of sit on this interface between company and investor disclosure. And one of the challenges we see, and it's well documented, is that investors aren't getting the information they need, and corporates don't know what information to disclose. I think there's a number of drivers that are kind of helping to address this. Obviously, regulation, both voluntary and mandatory, is playing a key part. TCFD is obviously a great example with its focus on scenarios, forward-looking, financially relevant metrics. We also have the changing dynamics, and I think it came up in the plenary yesterday about this recognition that climate risk is financial risk. Climate issues are impacting on company financial performance. And of course, the reason we're all here right now as well is this kind of notion of shifting investor expectations. So ESG becoming more integrated into the investment process. So these drivers really are kind of creating that demand for more transparency, and data, scenario, science will all play a part in that. So there's obviously still challenges and opportunities, and I'm sure we'll get to cover those in the discussion. But I thought I just might spend 2 or 3 minutes just going through some examples of work that we've been doing with clients, maybe starting on a more optimistic footing about what's actually happening right now. So the slide, which hopefully you can all see. Here we go, thank you. I can't see anymore, but so this really just shows the sort of evolution of climate analytics over the past several years, and really kind of as we go from sort of top left to bottom right is really the sort of increasing alignment with the TCFD. So top left-hand corner, we've sort of got the traditional carbon footprint metrics that I'm sure everyone's familiar with, so understanding the level of carbon exposure across portfolios compared to a benchmark. Now, obviously, this is a fundamental building block of any sort of climate reporting, but we have to recognise it is a starting point, and it's backward-looking to some degree, and it also has some blind spots to risk. So as we go over to the right-hand side, this is an example of some work that we've recently done with the government pension fund in Japan, GPIF, and they did a 2-degree alignment assessment with Trucost, and this is basically the results of that assessment, so showing how aligned their portfolios are with a 2-degree trajectory, and at an aggregator level, you can see that they're over 3 degrees, which means that currently those portfolios are misaligned with that trajectory. So obviously quite a big statement to make from one of the world's, well, if not the world's largest asset owner, but obviously a step in the right direction, probably representative of the market. And they're now using this to engage with their own asset managers to understand how they're responding to this and how they're thinking about this. So that just shows evolution, and then of course transition risk, the next thing really. And what we've been doing is looking at the impact of rising carbon prices on company financial performance, and then understanding what that looks like across a portfolio as well. So it's this kind of notion of the unpriced carbon risk, really. It's looking at where prices are today and where they need to be to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and then seeing what impact that might have on company profits. So this chart here shows, again, a portfolio view of unpriced carbon versus the benchmark and across different types of scenarios. And then finally, this is a data set we've been working on over the last few months. It's due to be launched later this month. And this is now looking at a physical risk, so completing that kind of picture from a TCFD perspective. I think this is an example of heat waves. So we're looking, the way we've approached this is really to look at different climate hazards and map those across the world. So things like heat waves, cold waves, sort of extreme weather events and so on. But crucially looking at asset level data as a way of kind of mapping that to companies. So looking at where companies are located around the world and then seeing how their assets are exposed to these types of risks. And then of course aggregating this back up to the portfolio level. So really just wanted to give a flavour of some of the work we've been doing and I guess the increasing alignment with TCFD. Thank you.
Great. Can you? Yeah, I think it works. Great. So yes, my name is Bruno Rois, and I work for Carbon Delta. Yeah, it doesn't look like the slide is up, but I think we can put it up later on. Maybe just a quick word of introduction for those of you who might not know Carbon Delta, because it is true that we were a fairly small company and very European centric. Essentially, Carbon Delta was founded in 2015 by a group of founders who worked in climate policy, computer science, and climate science. And I think that's important to mention because it dictates sort of what we do as a company. The idea was, so this was 2015, the year of the SDGs, the years of Paris Agreement, and the year, well, around the time where the idea of carbon bubble in financial markets became so maybe more mainstream. And so one of our founders, Oliver, who's this computer scientist and climate scientist, decided that he wanted to crack this measuring of climate risk in portfolios, and that the right way to do this was not to look at companies' disclosures, not so much because, company disclosures are not always unbiased, but also because it takes a lot of time to analyze them. But instead, this was going to be solved by a big data approach. And so what we really need is a computer, a machine to solve this measurement approach and integrate, 10, 20, it turns out now we have nearly 60 data sets integrated in our model, which is really a statistical, you could describe it as a big data model. And computes forward-looking, sort of independent measures of climate risk, both transition and physical risks, in portfolios at the level of securities. And so that's essentially what Carbon Delta set out to do. So we sometimes joke that we're a bunch of computer geeks who cared about climate, and I think that's in some ways that is true, but certainly it dictated our approach. if you could put up the slide maybe quickly. So again, Oliver says that if he only had one slide to show, he would show this slide. I don't always agree with him, but I thought, since he was the CEO of Carbon Delta, I should follow his lead, in case it got back to him that I chose the one slide. We had very strict guidelines; we could only have one slide. So our main measure of risk is something we call climate value at risk, which of course will ring familiar with finance practitioners of the idea of climate of value at risk. And really, what it is it's a forward-looking stress valuation metric on a security by security level. So it's forward-looking. The idea is that we model the impact of climate change on securities or on companies and on their securities, as opposed to perhaps the other way around, which is something that carbon footprinting would do. You look at the impact of companies on climate, and although that's ultimately the mission of Carbon Delta, the mission of Carbon Delta is to allow for the allocation of capital to the transition, the low carbon economy. From a purely risk perspective, the relevant question is really also is the flip side, is what is the impact of climate change on companies? What is the impact of policy on companies? What is the impact of physical risk on companies? And so that's kind of what climate value at risk does. We try to stress the valuation of companies and of their securities in different scenarios. We do this. So we have different metrics. We look at transition risks as well as transition opportunities, looking at patent portfolios and low carbon patents. We look at all sorts of physical risks as well. We look at temperature alignments of portfolios as well. And yeah, I think that might be. I think my time is up. So
cool.
Thank you.
Cool. Rick, best for last.
Thanks. So I'm Rick Walters from GRESB, or GRESB, whatever you like to call us. So we were set up 10 years ago, in fact, to assess and benchmark the ESG performance for initially real estate funds and companies, and 4 years ago we added infrastructure. So that's kind of the job that we've been given by the industry. We're very much a by industry for industry initiative based in Amsterdam, but global. And so this issue of resilience and more latterly TCFD, is obviously front of mind. We also survey our investor members to see their attitudes and what's on their minds, and this is probably the number one issue over a number of years for them. What do we do about this? How do we understand this better? All that sort of stuff. So, given that, and given all the movement in the industry from various players, and the interest from our investor members, our managers, our asset operators that are participating in GRESB, we responded to that by, for the first time last year, having a voluntary module just on resilience. And that was, so being voluntary, not everyone had to do it in terms of participating in GRESB. So you could do the GRESB assessment, very standardised assessment. It includes elements of carbon footprinting and so forth. But to go to a further deep dive into resilience, that was completely voluntary. So the number that we're doing that was a small number last year, but it doubled this year. So I think that shows an increasing interest, probably natural. And our normal process with modules is we'll do that for 3 years, see how it all goes. We improve it each year, and then we'll embed it into the main assessment as it basically becomes compulsory. So nothing's changed in terms of that plan. That is still the plan to do that, and we think that's right. What we've seen in that year is whereas the first year was a fairly generalised, full kind of resilience, high-level assessment, not just covering climate, but other social and other stresses and shocks. I guess the industry really wanted something way more TCFD aligned, and so we did that. So this year the assessment was as aligned as possible with the TCFD recommendations. And so that's what people responded to, and you can see the slide there. It's a little bit busy, but basically if we're looking at the companies and the funds that we cover, real estate, infrastructure at the fund level, infrastructure at the asset level, and looking at our metrics put into the key areas of the TCFD, you can see the responses and you can see the number. So we've got 228 real estate companies out of the over 1,000 that responded to that do the full assessment, 18 infrastructure funds out of the 107 that do the full assessment, and 60 infrastructure assets out of the 393 that did the full assessment. I won't go through the numbers but what you can see there is that, and we'll talk probably a bit more about what are people doing. But just while we've got the numbers up, you can see, firstly that real estate companies are probably ahead of infrastructure, certainly at the asset level. And you can see that governance, is maybe the easiest area to get on top of first and have something in place, have people in place, have these issues coming up to the board and so forth. Then as you go more down into making this real and implementing it, especially when you get to metrics and targets, it's harder. We'll talk about what's hard. And getting down to the asset level, especially with infrastructure, it's even harder again. So that relationship with the portfolio companies is a really important one to where we go with this, and I'm sure we'll discuss that a little bit more. But that hopefully gives you a little bit of a statistic of how is the industry going on this sort of stuff, and I think that's a good role that GRES can provide, is giving a barometer year on year of how are we going on all this sort of stuff. What are the leaders doing? What is the average, etc. And providing a standardised approach to that. That's what I guess we aim to offer at GRES.
Okay. I am actually going to come back to you on that very shortly, but before we come back to that question of what's hard and what people are struggling with, I want to touch on, without blowing the conversation out too broadly, I firstly just want to touch on this question of why are we doing the reporting? Or why do you find people are engaging with you to do the reporting? Who is using it and what are they using it for? Because many of the conversations many of you will have often end up in this kind of frustrated wail at the end of the conversation, which is, what do they even need this for anyway, and what are they doing with it? So I would love to hear your quick reflections on, in the conversations you've been having, what's the point? What do you think the point should be? Want to go first? Right next to me.
I guess, just based on the experience of working with corporates and investors, I think quite often it can depend on the reporting framework and, what the intended use is. So some corporates are taking a sort of multi-stakeholder perspective and communicating to their customers, investors and so on, where others are sort of more targeted. What I like, I guess, about the TCFD in particular is it is focusing on that interaction between companies, issuers and investors, and really focusing on that kind of increasing transparency. But what I would say is that there's no point having a reporting framework if it doesn't lead to better decisions, and that data needs to be usable. So just to give you an example, obviously I talked about GPIF, using the results of 2-degree alignment for engagement, obviously taking a decision and engaging with their own asset managers. But at a corporate level, we've also been working with companies who are using transition risk and in particular carbon pricing risk exposure at the asset level to understand where they can make investments in renewable energy projects that will deliver the most value. So just a couple of quick examples there, but I think the biggest thing is making sure that it leads to more informed decisions.
Mm-hmm. No, I would definitely echo that point on decisions. At Carbon Delta, we work predominantly, nearly exclusively with investors, so I have less experience working with corporates, but I think, there's a few reasons why, as an investor, you would want to do a TCFD report, right? Of course, is to inform the investor community, i.e. people who might invest in you, like just in the same way as you are a corporate. I think there's a regulatory element of it as well, that you want to show that you're advanced and you're proactive. So all of these sort of expected use cases or cases, but I think one of the things that I've noticed, and I think that's not just, that's true for corporates as well, is that companies who go through that cycle of preparing the TCFD report, so I'm thinking here about the insurance companies, for example, come out transformed as well. So in some ways, the reporting is for the outside, but it has a major transformative impact on them as well, because it raises a lot of questions. And I think it's not true just for TCFD report. I've heard the same argument being made a few years back for responding to CDP or for issuing a green bond, for example, right? There's something really that changes inside a company. There's a lot of questions that are being asked and that you have to think about, and certainly the dialogue inside of those institutions changes as well. So one of the examples that I like to make, also because it's one of the few public ones, is we have companies like AXA and Aviva who have used our temperature alignment metrics to look at the temperature of their portfolios versus some major benchmarks. And some of the questions that come out of that is, okay, well, we're beating the benchmark, but we're still more than a full degree above 2 degrees. So how can we build 2-degree portfolios? And turns out it's extremely complicated. Anyway, maybe I can talk about that later. But I think that's one of my favorite examples anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Rick, would you?
Yeah, maybe just keeping it brief. I agree with all of that. I would say that in some cases people don't know what they're using it for or what they're going to use it for. And I think it's quite an exciting time in this respect of TCFD's only like a couple of years old, and look how institutionalized it sort of is or is certainly becoming. And it's the same with other things. You look at how fast the EU taxonomy is moving. There's a lot of these sort of new initiatives that people are like, well, this is important. We need to understand this issue. We need to get this data. We need to use it. We don't know how yet. We're going to figure it out. And we're just fully on board with this. So this is kind of the exciting space we're in now is with ESG data in general, is that people know it's valuable, they know they need to have it, they know it's going to be part of investment decision-making and business intelligence, and they want it, and they're going to start figuring out how to use it as they get it. So it's an interesting kind of world we're in. That's why big data is so important to that, because unless you can, one, get it, figure out how to analyze it, and use it and make it useful, and then figure out what the use case is. That's all happening sort of dynamically at one time, which is really interesting. So I think exciting that we can all kind of be a part of that, and that there's a willingness to kind of learn as we go. That it's not like, oh well, I'm not going to do something until this is completely standardized and I know what output I'm going to get from it. We're well beyond that now, which is really exciting.
Yeah, one of the interesting reflections from around PRI recently, at least for some, I think, Australian Asian investors talking to people in the region, or at least one of the things that jumped out for us, was that there was a very high willingness, particularly among the companies, to jump into a problem and say, we're not really 100% sure how we're going to solve this thing yet, but we're just kind of broadly going to give it a crack because we're aware it's the direction we need to head in and we need to reach best practice. But it sort of sounds from that like we've almost got two reasons to do this. One is to support decision making, and that's at a market level and a company level, and another reason is to, in addition to reasons we might discover, for the strategic input to the company, so the transformation of the company's direction. Rick, I'm going to throw to you and ask you to go back to that question of what people are finding hard, because as you said, you've done quite a bit of work on this.
Yeah, and I think it is. There's a data challenge for sure, and when it comes to TCFD, it's there's metrics and there's numbers in there, but there's also a huge qualitative element in there and forward-looking. So you're suddenly throwing these new kind of questions at people. About strategy and what are they doing and how are they building certain things in and how are they looking into the future, and then expecting them to disclose all that to investors and other stakeholders. So I think there's a big challenge around the uncomfortable, like you were saying, the uncomfortable but important thinking that's happening internally and that's driving. But then getting comfortable with sharing this. We largely deal with private markets, and so they're always a little bit careful about what data they provide and who that goes to, and they want to manage and control that, which is understandable. So I think that's probably one of the things is one, it's sort of hard data to kind of grasp. It's not just getting a few numbers or something. It's like tell us your strategy, and put it in a form that's digestible and we can learn from and include in our analysis. Oh, easy, And then there's the comfort of sharing that. I'm starting to share this. It's not backward-looking stuff anymore. This is forward-looking. This is like, where are we going? This is how we're going to respond to challenges. It's a very different sort of set of things that people are sharing. So I think it's those two combined is perhaps some of the challenges for people.
Can I dig into that a little bit and just... So on the question of, I think there's, when we talk about this, and this goes to forward-looking, it goes to the metrics challenge, I think we have a hope and a desire that we'll get to a point where we've got some metrics that make sense for everyone and are obvious metrics, and also where we've got data which operates at a level where we have the type of transparency we've got in our financial decision making or we're accustomed to having. Do you think that that's a realistic outcome, that we'll get to an understanding of some core metrics and we'll get that level of transparency? And what sort of timeline?
Yeah, we absolutely will. If you look at the financial industry, I'd love to go back in a time machine and see what the discussions were 100 years ago when people are talking about, what do you mean you want my profit data and you want it like in this format? We don't do that. I'm sure there were those discussions. We haven't got 100 years, of course. So the interesting thing is to see how fast this, and it is moving fast. It's a fast-moving space, to see how fast it can come together and be standardised. And we want to, we're very much part of that. we always sort of pride ourselves on being hopefully part of the solution, not part of the problem in terms of reporting burden and all these kind of things. So we really want to work with everybody to move to those standard ways of measuring things, imperfect as they sometimes turn out to be, but at least it gives everyone the same sort of sets of information that they can rely upon. They know what it actually is. You know, if you're giving me this number or this statement, I kind of can take that and I understand your context, and if someone else is saying something slightly different, I can look at the two and compare. That's what investors want, I think, and I think we're working very hard to move towards that. And you know, this, I guess, being by industry for industry again, we want to play our role, and we want to work with other partners, and we do partner with other organisations, you know, like the others on the panel, to work out how to move to those things. And I think there'll be kind of a couple of elements. There'll be very broad standardised stuff, you know, that we'll kind of be very involved in. And then there'll be very sort of specific things that will be bespoke, maybe to one company, one industry, one project and assignment, you know, to get something out that's really specific. And I think we're going to see both sort of moving along this journey at the same time.
Yeah, okay.
We need both.
Yep. Bruno and Steve, can I throw to you to talk a little bit about, we were always going to get to data, but let's do data now and then we can do other things in a moment. Can I throw to you guys to talk a little bit about the data question, particularly even, I mean, the question of do you solve the data through the company reporting lens, which is one way of solving it, or through the, I've heard it called hostile analysis lens, or which is the sort of big data aspect, right? Yeah. I'll get information about you without you giving it to me. I'd sort of be interested to hear both your views on that.
Sure, yeah. I that's one of my favorite topics. I love to talk about that.
Not like 15 minutes of you.
No. And by the way, I don't know how my co-panelists are faring with the heat of those lamps, but I feel like my brains are frying a little bit. So if I make no sense, I blame the spotlights behind me. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is of course that we're now been acquired by MSCI. And we think that's a tremendously exciting opportunity for many reasons, but partly is that reason. So our approach, as I mentioned earlier, it was going to be the big data approach, you know, and I like to think about this in terms of man versus machine nearly, you know. So what we built was the machine, and we have all these data sets, literally dozens of data sets. We have a methodology. We have, of course, data cleansing and all of that in terms of processes, but eventually you get this data, you get it through the methodology, press play, and you have a number, right? And it's the same methodology for all companies, and therefore you have the standardization that Rick, you were talking about, which we think is really important. But it's only part of the story, right? So we were on the extreme end of that spectrum, but not necessarily because we thought that was the only thing that mattered, but it's just maybe because we felt like we had an advantage there, and that's, you know, and then that's where we ended up. Of course, that doesn't mean that we shun the bottom-up analysis, right? And that doesn't mean that when a client, which happens very, very often, said, well, you know, you say this, but this company has made a decision to phase out of this utility, has made a decision to phase out of coal, whereas this other company that has more or less the same fuel mix today is saying they invest in more coal, and yet they have the similar risk metric in your portfolio because they have no patents, which is one of the way we analyze change. We don't necessarily go like, no, we have the truth. No, I mean, the bottom-up analysis has a place, you know, and makes sense to have a granular analysis of disclosures. And of course, that's one of the things that MSCI ESG research does. And so we're really excited to combine those two things because we think it really makes sense to look at both. Certainly, if I was on the buy side and I was looking at investments, I would look at both. And in fact, it is a fact that at Carbon Delta, most of our clients use different data provider. We're very rarely the only one, and I think that really makes sense. So I think there's a place for both approaches.
Okay, Steve.
I certainly agree with that. I think there's a place for both approaches. I guess you shared an acquisition story, so I'll share one as well. We were recently acquired by S&P Global, and I guess what's the
latest favourite thing to do if you're a large data provider is to acquire an ESG startup.
But I think what that's demonstrated is that there's a lot of data out there, and that's why I feel quite optimistic. There's a lot of data that's being collected for other purposes, but can be synthesized to provide insights relating to climate risk. So, you know, when we were building the physical risk data set, we sort of unearthed all of this asset level data that was being collected within S&P Global that obviously had value for this product, because you can't provide a robust assessment of physical risk without knowing where assets are located around the world, and that sort of geo-specific information, which I think is probably one of the biggest gaps right now, actually, is that geo-specific information, because a lot of these things we're talking about do have a location-specific impact. So I think, just to summarise, there is a place for top-down and bottom-up, but just to come back to that point about decision-making, I think if you are going to make decisions, then you need to have that kind of, that deeper lens.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to move into the question. Oh, we've got questions. Okay, I'm going to go for Elaine and then Sybil. Nick, we'll see how long this takes.
Thanks, Zoe. And a question initially for Stephen. You showed the portfolio carbon intensity trajectory and then compared with a 2-degree trajectory. Just wondering, with the 2-degree version, are you building that up from a view of how different industries will transition over time, or where does that come from? And second, in both the numbers, are Scope 3 numbers included?
Thanks for the question. On the first point, yes, we're looking at how different industries will transition. So this is looking at historical trends in carbon performance for different industries and different companies, but also looking at the targets they're setting, their asset mix going forward, and any forward-looking information that we can garner. So it's very specific to the industrial challenges, but also specific to those companies. At the moment, the data just is focused on Scope 1 and Scope 2. We do have an ambition to incorporate Scope 3 in the not too distant future, but that comes with some challenges as well. So yeah, but that is certainly the intention.
We would highly commend a lean towards Scope 3, because it's Elaine and my favourite thing, among some others here. Sybil.
Just to add to the Scope 3 conversation, around the physical resilience as well, how, and again, this is the what's really hard bucket, so not expecting solutions, just planting seeds for future work. Around how to monitor and measure sort of supply chain impacts in terms of physical resilience, how those supply chain effects will expand out. We do have a reasonably interconnected world when it comes to where a lot of things are being made, and how those stress points translate across a portfolio with respect to climate change, and how as investors we can see where those risks are, because often it's 3 or 4 levels down and it's not necessarily easy to observe.
I'm going to ask anyone on the panel who wants to reflect on that to reflect on that.
I'd love to reflect on that, because it's as much as most of us can do at this point is reflect on it and try to build the models, which we're doing as well. So I sympathize with the not too distant future. So we have some Scope 3 data. We have those models. They're not fully into production mode, because it's incredibly hard. You have those 15 categories. They all have a different, you model them in a very different way, business, travel, and use of products, and investing. They're completely different ways to look at those things. And then when you have Scope 3 footprints, you still don't have a supply chain analysis, right? It's yet a completely different thing. And then how many steps do you go into the supply chain analysis? One is not enough. You really want to look at the whole system, so you need to start throwing around words like, global equilibrium models, and it's incredibly complicated, and yet I think unless we do that, we capture only part of the risk. So I mean, maybe this is going into a little bit further into the discussions, but I often say, and I don't know how popular it makes me with my employers, but I often say that climate data is incredibly better, and I also believe that it will be to a point where it will be good enough, but I don't think it is there yet, right? And I think we have a lot more work to do, and supply chain, in my opinion, is one of those places. I have a few other areas that I think we should get better at, but supply chain is probably the number one on my list.
Steve, you have 30 seconds.
30 seconds. No, it's okay. Just to add, I guess we do have the building blocks for Scope 3 analysis. So we have ways of estimating greenhouse gas emissions through supply chains using things like input-output models and things like that. But it's the overlaying the physical risk, overlaying 2-degree alignment. That's where it becomes slightly more challenging. But just wanted to clarify that point.
I'm going to take Nick's question because he's had his hand up for a while over here. And then we're going to have a quick chat about solutions, and then we're going to do another round of questions. I can see, yes, all right, cool. We'll got one here, one there, and then, yep.
Thanks, Zoe. This question's about magicians and black boxes. Magicians like black boxes because you can just pull just about anything out of them. You know, rabbits, doves, flowers. To the panelists, how transparent are the approaches you use in your big data?
I might start. We publish all of our frameworks online, so they're all readily accessible. That's our policy, and that has its challenges. But we just think that's the best way to do things. Again, being by industry for industry, we do update our assessment each year. Kind of in a manner with the industry, with getting feedback, etc. That's again uncomfortable in some cases because it's making small incremental improvements, moving the goalposts a little bit. But it's our one of our core competencies to do that, and we think that's the best way to do it. But I understand other reasons why black boxes and doing more sort of analysis that as you discover things during the analysis, you can change the outputs and the outcomes makes sense as well. So I can understand the need in some cases for more of a black box approach. There's definitely advantages to that, and still delivering the right outcomes. But again, we probably need both. But we'll see what these guys want to say.
Sure. Just to agree there. We are completely transparent about all of the underlying assumptions and data sets that we use. And the main reason for that is that these are uncertain metrics, and we're not going to combat the fear of this uncertainty if we're secretive about the assumptions and those things. So just to build comfort in the data is important, and that's why we're very transparent about the caveats and the assumptions and all of those underlying decisions that were made in aggregating these data sets.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I was just going to agree and essentially say. It's a challenge. The more complex your model is, the more challenging it is to show, just from a practical perspective as well, right? So we try and we send spreadsheets with the individual calculation steps, but the more complex your model is, the more challenging it is, of course. And in the interest of time, maybe I'll leave it there. But just what I often say is, as a small company that's starting, you're trying to show something new to clients. You can't really show a black box. I don't think we would have lasted long as a black box provider.
So I'm going to take moderator privilege and ask a question, and then I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 because we've got questions lining up. So the question, I'm going to compress a bunch of the questions we're going to talk about into one and say, with respect to the needs we talked about before, decision making, corporate strategy, and this kind of iterative learning process we're going through, what solutions do you see people using at the moment that are most serving those needs and most promising? And where is our tool development not meeting those needs? Rick, do you want to start? And then we're going to do questions.
Yeah, I think we have the advantage that we're focused on real estate and infrastructure, so very specific sections of the economy and investors' needs. So maybe that helps a little bit, but I think the ones that are doing the best are kind of getting their head around the scenarios, are doing the exploration within their organizations about giving this meaning and what does it mean to inform strategy, and then how do they communicate that. So there's kind of like this whole process that they're all going through with that. And then the ones who are even best out of those best are somehow, in depending on what they're doing, bringing that into their financial analysis and their more strategic analysis about where are they going. They might be setting targets, but they're actually saying, what might this mean for us under different scenarios about the future in terms of what we invest in, what we don't invest in, how we engage with inactive ownership and so forth. So there's a little bit of a general answer, but that's in a way because, GRES, we're not providing strategic, really bespoke, specific advice to anybody. We're providing that broad, standardized industry view, whereas I think some of the assignments that you guys might be on, you are getting right into that specific strategic advice to those who are using it in a really nuanced kind of way. So I'm interested to hear some of those that kind of case study.
You're up, Bruno.
So I mentioned earlier that I think the data is still has room for improvement. I think was one way to put it. And I think so. I like to think about these things in terms of coverage, right? So I think there are some risks that we don't cover yet, right? Supply chain risk being one of them. I think of litigation risk. I think of other types of climate risks that I think are substantial, significant material that we don't really cover yet. But then also coverage of asset classes. So at Carbon Delta, we cover equities. We started covering equities, then we started covering corporate bonds because it's quite easy when you already do the equities of a company. Then we started doing real estate as well. And we thought we were quite, cute with that. We thought we were quite at the advanced, the frontier of it. And what we see is that a lot of investors are saying, well, what about sovereigns? You know, I'm a pension fund, I have loads of sovereigns. And what about munis, you know, when you're in the US? And what about infrastructure? And so now we're thinking, okay, we really have to get up to speed with those asset classes as well. And so, I mean, to your question, I think what investors are so I completely echo the investors that do the best, you know, get into the scenario, get into the financial impact, get into all of that. I see that they also are forced to, at some point, use different providers for different asset classes. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily an issue, but I think it's a bit suboptimal as well. So I think into the future, hopefully we can get approaches that are a bit more comprehensive and maybe a bit more, not agnostic of asset classes, because asset classes matter in terms of risk, but maybe a bit more inclusive of all asset classes.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree on sort of extending to different asset classes. I think I'd probably just make a point about also extending to different issues. So I guess what I'm generally concerned about is sort of siloing of specific issues when they're inherently interconnected. So, for example, you know, TCFD focused on climate change, but what about biodiversity, water issues? What I wouldn't like to see is a different reporting initiative for those two issues that is completely separate. They kind of have to be together because they can become easily forgotten about, and that's a genuine concern. And then one final point is really just, and it came out in the TCFD status report, is this more focus on sort of translating these climate risks into financial risks, because there's still more work to be done in that regard. And I think a lot of the underlying transition scenarios, you know, they often look at energy and the economy and policy, but actually the bit that's missing is the financial impact on companies. So actually starting from that starting point, thinking about those financial implications could be a way of developing that area and making it easier to do scenario analysis.
Yeah, okay. All right, I'm going to take 3 questions now, and I'm going to actually take them in a row, so no one respond to them until we get to the end, because otherwise we're going to run out of time. Sam, you go first.
Yes, thank you. Question on standardization and benchmarking of real estate investment trusts and real estate as a whole. Obviously, key sector, but not directly covered by the sectoral decarbonization approach. Reporting on physical risk is patchy. So I wonder if you have any insights or examples into existing or emerging methodologies or issuers that have come with a way of comparing their exposure to physical risk with another company, and perhaps getting a sense of their Paris alignment or level of ambition in relation to their long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction target.
Okay. Courtney, do you want to tell me your question and I can then talk it out so we don't... Oh, no.
Courtney Lawrence with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So I'm an emerging market investor, and I sit in Beijing, and today there is a TCFD workshop in Beijing. My question to you all is, what are your insights on how disclosure is going in emerging markets, particularly in Asia?
And then we've got a question from the National Science Agency in the corner. All right, team, you're at liberty to respond to these as you feel fit.
I'll start with the real estate one, just to maybe to knock it off. They're all challenging areas, but we are very focused on the real estate issue. We're in a number of projects and partnerships. I think this will come up again and again. That one of the keys to this, and that goes with government as well, is that we're not going to move as fast as we need to move without working in partnerships and without using the smart people to get together and solve these problems. And so we're involved with some of you guys on the panel. We're involved in a very important initiative called CREM, which is a carbon risk real estate monitoring, which is an EU-funded project, which is looking exactly at 2-degree trajectories and things like that, and setting standardised trajectories for real estate in that case. So I encourage you, if you want to see more detail on that, look up the CREM, CRREM website. And that's not the only one. There's a number of other initiatives like that going on. So I think the partnerships, the government, maybe we'll come back to emerging markets. Let these guys have a say.
I'd just like to talk on standardization because I think it covers two questions. And I think nearly everybody in this room will know that anything that is anything in finance is essentially standardized, right? So whether you're looking at accounting is standardized, regulatory capital requirements for banks and insurance companies are more or less broadly standardized. Contracts are standardized. Anything that takes off and achieves scale is standardized. And I think that was one of the reasons we decided to model the things the way we model those things, is that what we do is every single security in our methodology is treated the same way, right? So it gives you the same treatment across security, so that you can look at those things saying, okay, well, it's the same metric. It means the same thing. It's the same scenario. It's not a specific oil and gas scenario versus a specific coal scenario versus a specific utility scenario. And we think that's really important. Again, that doesn't mean that there's no space for more granular, bespoke analysis, but I think it really makes sense to do that, also for reporting, also for regulatory requirements and things like that. In terms of the role of science, I have to say I haven't had a chance to really think about that, so I'm sort of thinking on my feet. I'm not sure what is going to come out of my mouth just now, but I think there's the role of government and science, of course, is underpinning all of this. There's this concept in, I can't remember what author it is, but there's this idea that voluntary initiatives, voluntary policy as opposed to regulation, right, comes in the shadow of hierarchy, right? And this is this idea that we're doing it ourselves. Look, we don't need government, but really we're doing it ourselves because we know the stick is coming if we're not doing it ourselves, right? And I think the role of government for sure, for now, has been that. And the role of science in advancing this dialogue and this conversation, I think, has been also tremendously important.
Steve, you're on Asia and emerging markets disclosure. I don't care if you had something to say about the other points.
No, okay. I think you're right. I think it is lagging at the moment in terms of disclosure. We see that in the companies that we cover. But there are sort of promising growth areas. I think there are leaders that are showing the way. We're engaged with a number of Chinese companies, for example, and supporting them with disclosure. But at the moment, unfortunately, we are relying on models, information, and proxies for that risk. And hopefully that over time, as we see this proliferation of TCFD and other global initiatives like that we will see increased disclosure. But at the moment, it is certainly lagging.
All right. So Crystal's been politely signalling to me that it's time to wrap up for a while. I want to finish by reflecting that I think we had to the conversation we had earlier about taking a time machine back into previous financial markets and seeing the conversations people used to have about the P&L and the balance sheet. I recently got to hear Ronald Cohen, who's 73, reflecting on what it was like watching the market trying to price risk for the first time, and how much no one knew how to price risk when they started pricing risk. And what we're trying to do here is figure out how to, and he was saying, it's going to be risk, return, and impact, because he's real big about impact. But it's probably going to be risk, return, and social utility or surrounding issues, right? Something like ESG, we don't have a word for it yet. What we're trying to do here is build that information system that's going to support our thinking about that, and we currently don't really know how to do it. So I want to put that forward both as it's hard, but it's also really, really hopeful, because that's a really exciting project. But I'm going to close with a question to each of the panelists, which you need to answer quickly. And I'm sorry, it's not going to be super hopeful. But we all thought this was an interesting question before, which is why I'm asking it. So the question we had this morning about uncertainty and physical risk and our ability to really model the full scope of climate changes. Do you think that we might, in our financial analysis and data support tools get to a point where we can think about that broader system risk, let's say in the next 5 years, and you've got 140 characters. And then we're done.
Yes, I think so. And I think it'll come, that's a personal opinion, but I think it might actually come from things that we don't even think about just collectively in this room. I think it might come from some breakthrough, something like maybe satellite imaging. Of course, people have thought about that, but I'm thinking more something that we actually haven't thought about, and that suddenly makes everything much easier. That's sort of my, and I don't know why I think that, but it's just my opinion.
Even like maybe blockchain or something. But I think the other thing that may drive it is there could be some big disaster, and people are like, oh, we need to have information on this to make sure we're ready for this kind of thing again. We're kind of caught off guard now, so that could be. But I do think in the next 5 years, it'll be in certain sections, but absolutely we'll get on top of the main issues and that are the surprising ones.
Yeah, completely agree. I think it could be event-driven. There could be something that emerges that we haven't thought about. But I think one thing as we develop and broaden our understanding of these different risks is to make sure that we're trying to relate them back to a common metric and way of understanding, because then you can sort of manage those sort of trade-offs. So, as an example, we're working on physical risk. And it's the early stages, but where we really want to get to with that is how that then translates into financial risks and opportunities, and that will take some time. But then it can be sort of viewed alongside things like transition risk to give that more sort of holistic picture. So
cool. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your great questions, and thank you to the panel for sitting here under these extraordinary lights and holding forth for this. But thanks very much for your attention.